Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime and Architecture. Tonight, we are going to talk about one of the largest things human beings have ever built with their hands. A structure so long that if you walked it from one end to the other, it would take you more than a year and a half to finish. A wall that climbed mountains, crossed deserts, dipped into river valleys, and wound through grasslands that go on for hundreds and hundreds of miles. The Great Wall of China is not just a wall. It is a collection of walls built across more than 2,000 years by millions of people whose names were never recorded anywhere. If you enjoy what we do here on this channel, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps, and it means a lot. And before we begin, drop a comment below with your location and your local time tonight. It is always lovely to know where in the world people are listening from, whether you are in a quiet bedroom in Europe, a late night in North America, or somewhere early in Asia just starting the day with a calm moment. Get yourself comfortable, adjust your pillow, pull the covers a little closer, and let yourself begin to settle. Tonight we are drifting into the story of the Great Wall of China, and there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. Just listen. Here is one fact before we begin. The mortar used to hold the stones of the Great Wall together during the Ming dynasty, which lasted roughly from the mid-1300s to the early 1600s, was partially made from sticky rice. Glutinous rice was boiled down and mixed into the binding material, and this rice-based mortar turned out to be stronger and more water-resistant than plain lime mortar on its own. Researchers have tested sections of the wall standing today and found this rice compound still holding firm after more than 500 years. Sticky rice, holding up mountains. Now, let us begin at the very beginning, which is not quite where most people expect it to be. Most people, when they imagine the Great Wall, picture a single enormous structure stretching across northern China in one long, unbroken line. They picture it as something that was planned, approved, and then built from scratch in one great effort. But that is not what happened. The story of the Great Wall is actually the story of dozens of walls built by different people in different centuries for different reasons, slowly being connected, extended, abandoned, rebuilt, and rerouted over a span of more than 2,000 years. The earliest walls in northern China did not even have a single shared name. They were regional barriers, built by individual kingdoms that were competing with each other and also trying to defend themselves from the nomadic groups who lived beyond the agricultural heartland. These nomadic peoples, most notably groups that Chinese historical records refer to broadly as northern tribes, were skilled horsemen and raiders who could move quickly across open land. The kingdoms of northern China, which depended on settled farming and cities, needed a way to slow that movement down. So they built walls, not one wall, many walls, and for a very long time nobody was thinking about connecting them into anything unified. The earliest recorded wall-building activity in China dates back to approximately the 7th century before the Common Era. That is roughly 2,700 years ago. At this period in history, the Chinese landmass was not yet a single unified empire. It was a collection of competing states, each with its own ruler, its own army, and its own set of enemies. The state of Chu, in the south, built walls to mark its territory and protect its borders from neighbouring states. The states of Wei, Zhao, and Yan, in the north, built their own earthen barriers facing outward toward the steppe, the vast flat grassland where the nomadic groups lived and moved. These early walls were not made of stone. Almost none of them were. The technology and the labour required to cut and haul stone in large quantities was simply not available to most of these smaller states in any practical way. Instead, the walls were built from rammed earth, a construction technique that is exactly what it sounds like. Workers would take soil, often mixed with gravel or organic material like reeds and branches, pack it into a wooden frame or mould, and pound it down layer by layer until it compressed into a hard, dense block. Once the frame was removed, the result was a solid earthen wall that could stand for decades if it stayed reasonably dry. Rammed earth construction sounds simple, and in some ways it was, but it required enormous amounts of coordinated human labour. Workers had to dig, carry, pack and pound continuously, and the walls they built were not small. Some sections rose to heights of several metres, wide enough at the top for soldiers to walk along. The rammed earth was sometimes reinforced with stones at the base to help with drainage, and in some areas the surface was plastered with a lime coating to protect against erosion. The walls built by these early warring states were not continuous. They were patchy and inconsistent. A wall might run for a few dozen miles along one ridge and then stop, or it might follow a river valley for a while and then disappear when the terrain became too difficult. Some sections overlapped or ran parallel to each other. Others pointed in completely different directions because they had been built to face different threats. There was no master plan. There was no single architect or ruler looking down at a map and drawing one long line from east to west. What there was, instead, was a recurring recognition across many different generations and many different rulers that a physical barrier along the northern edge of settled land was useful, not always effective, not always maintained, but useful enough that people kept returning to the idea over and over again across century after century. The landscape where these walls were built was not gentle. Northern China, especially along the areas where the agricultural zone meets the steppe, is not flat farmland. It is a complicated terrain of dry ridges, loose soil, seasonal rivers, and in many places steep and rocky hills. Building any kind of structure across this landscape required careful observation of the ground, constant adaptation of technique, and a tolerance for working in conditions that range from baking summer heat in the lowlands to brutal winter cold in the higher elevations. Workers on these early walls would have lived in temporary camps near the construction site. They carried materials by hand, by animal, and sometimes by building simple wooden frames that allowed loads to be passed from person to person up a slope. There were no cranes, no pulleys of significant mechanical advantage, and no vehicles that could navigate rough mountain terrain. Everything moved through human effort. One interesting aspect of these early walls is that many of them were not built on the very top of ridgelines. They were often built just below the ridge, on the side facing outward toward the steppe. This was a deliberate choice. A wall sitting on the very crest of a hill is exposed to wind and weather from both directions and offers no natural shelter for the defenders standing behind it. By placing the wall slightly below the crest on the outer slope, builders gave their soldiers the advantage of higher ground, while the wall itself was partially protected from the worst weather. This kind of practical, landscape-sensitive thinking runs through the entire history of the Great Wall, from the earliest rammed earth barriers all the way to the massive stone and brick structures of the Ming dynasty. The people building these walls were not just following orders with shovels. They were observing the land, making calculations about sightlines and drainage and wind, and adapting their designs to an environment that was never cooperative. The early walls built by the warring states were also, in many cases, built against each other. This is one of the stranger facts about the wall's history. When historians and archaeologists map out the locations of these early earthen barriers, they find that some of them were not positioned to face the nomadic north at all. Some of them were positioned to face neighbouring Chinese kingdoms. The wall's history begins not as a single unified defence against an outside threat, but as a patchwork of competing boundaries between people who shared a language and a civilization but could not agree on who should be in charge of it. The warring states and early walls, for roughly 500 years, from around the 5th century before the Common Era to the late 3rd century before the Common Era, the Chinese landmass was divided among a shifting collection of kingdoms that historians refer to collectively as the Warring States. The name is accurate. This was a period of near constant military conflict, diplomatic manoeuvring, shifting alliances, and the occasional complete destruction of one state by another. 7 major kingdoms dominated the landscape at the height of this period: Qin, Chu, Yan, Han, Wei, Zhao, and Qi. Each of them was large enough to field substantial armies, and each of them had reasons to both fear their neighbours and protect their northern borders from the steppe. What is striking about this period, from an architectural standpoint, is just how much building was happening at the same time across so many different political entities. While these kingdoms were fighting each other, they were also, simultaneously, constructing earthen walls and barrier systems along their own territorial edges. The construction was not coordinated. There was no shared standard for height, width, or material. But there was a shared logic, the recognition that a physical line drawn across the landscape, even an imperfect one, changed how an enemy had to think about movement. The state of Zhao, in particular, built substantial walls along its northern border during the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era. Zhao occupied a position on the Chinese landmass that made it especially vulnerable to pressure from the nomadic groups to the north, particularly the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples who would remain a significant presence in Chinese military and political calculations for centuries. The walls Zhao built were long and reasonably well maintained by the standards of the time, and they involved a network of signal stations and garrison points where soldiers could be stationed and supplies could be stored. The state of Yan, to the northeast, built its own northern walls in a similar period. Yan's walls extended into what is now the northeastern part of China, covering terrain that was different from the dry highlands of the northwest, more forested, more varied in elevation, and in some places quite cold for much of the year. Building in this terrain presented different challenges than building across the semi-arid plateaus further west, and the walls Yan constructed reflected those local conditions in their materials and their routing. The state of Qin, which would eventually become the most powerful of all 7 kingdoms, also built walls along its northern and northwestern borders. Qin was geographically positioned in the northwest, in a region that is now roughly Shaanxi and Gansu provinces. The terrain there is dramatic deep river valleys carved into the Loess Plateau, a type of fine, yellowish wind-blown soil that is extremely common in northern China. Loess is remarkably easy to work with in rammed earth construction because it compacts readily and holds its shape well when dry. Qin's early walls made extensive use of this local material. Fun fact: the state of Qin, which eventually gave its name to the entire country, China is widely believed to derive from Qin, pronounced roughly as Qin, was considered somewhat rough and uncivilized by the more established eastern kingdoms for much of the Warring States period. The eastern states had older traditions of literature, ritual and philosophy, and they looked down on Qin as a peripheral, militarized society on the edge of the known world. Qin, for its part, responded by becoming extraordinarily efficient at war, administration, and construction. The lesson being, apparently, that being underestimated is sometimes useful. The walls of the Warring States period were not purely military structures. They also served as administrative markers. In a time before modern surveying and legal systems of land ownership, a physical wall along a border communicated something very clear. This side belongs to us, that side does not. The walls marked where tax collection applied, where military law was in force, where the settled population ended and the open steppe began. They were bureaucratic objects as much as they were defensive ones. There was also a psychological dimension to wall building during this era. A ruler who built walls was communicating to his own population that he was investing in their protection. He was demonstrating organizational capacity, the ability to mobilize workers, coordinate logistics, and see a large project through to completion. In a period where political legitimacy was constantly being tested on the battlefield, the ability to construct something large and permanent was a statement of power and permanence. The workforce that built these early walls was drawn from several sources. Agricultural labourers were conscripted during the seasons when farming was less intensive, typically after the harvest. Soldiers who were stationed along the border were required to participate in construction work as part of their duties. Convicted criminals and prisoners of war were also sent to work on walls and other large public projects. This mixture of conscripted farmers, soldiers and forced labourers would remain the basic model for wall construction in China for more than 1,000 years. A short side story belongs here. During the Warring States period, a philosopher and military strategist named Mozi, sometimes written as Mo Tzu, became famous for his theories about defensive architecture. Mozi and his followers, known as the Mohists, developed detailed technical knowledge about how to build and defend fortifications. They wrote extensively about wall construction, siege tactics, and the geometry of defensive structures. Mohist scholars would sometimes travel to kingdoms that were under threat of attack and offer their services as defensive engineers, advising on how to strengthen walls, where to position archers, and how to design gates that were harder to break through. The Mohists represented a fascinating moment in history when philosophical thought and practical engineering were practiced by the same people as part of the same tradition. The mortar, or rather, the binding material used in these early Warring States walls was often nothing more than the soil itself, compressed with enough force to become essentially self-binding. Rammed earth does not require any added adhesive if the soil composition is right. The key is getting the moisture content correct before pounding begins. Too wet and the material will not compact properly. Too dry and it will crack and crumble when the formwork is removed. Experienced construction workers of the period developed a good intuitive sense for the right consistency, testing the soil by squeezing handfuls and observing how it held together. In areas where the soil was not ideal, builders mixed in organic material, straw, reeds, branches from local shrubs to add tensile strength to the compressed earth. This is a technique with a very long history in human construction, appearing in earthen architecture traditions across Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, as well as China. The parallel development of similar building techniques in completely separate civilizations is one of those quiet facts about human ingenuity that is easy to overlook. The walls of this period were also, quite frequently, in the wrong place from a purely strategic standpoint. The alignment of a wall depended on local political agreements, land ownership, existing roads, and the availability of material near the construction site, not always on the ideal military crest of the terrain. A wall built in a valley, because there was good clay nearby, offered less visibility than a wall on a ridge above. A wall that followed a straight line because it was administratively convenient might offer attackers a blind corner to approach from. These compromises were real, and military commanders knew about them. The walls of the Warring States were useful but imperfect, and every ruler who inherited them understood that they would need attention and improvement. By the late 3rd century before the Common Era, the geopolitical situation in China was moving rapidly toward a resolution that nobody entirely anticipated. The state of Qin, which had spent generations reforming its administration and military under the influence of a political philosophy called legalism, a brutally practical set of ideas about state power, law, and control, had become significantly more powerful than any of its rivals. One by one, the other kingdoms fell. Han fell in 230 BCE, Zhao fell in 228, Wei in 225, Chu in 223, Yan in 222, and finally Qi in 221 BCE. The king of Qin, a man who had come to the throne as a child and grown up in the middle of military campaigns and court intrigue, now ruled everything. He was 29 years old, and he had just unified the Chinese landmass for the first time in history. He gave himself a new title, Qin Shi Huang, meaning roughly the first sovereign emperor of Qin, and one of the first things he decided to do with this enormous new empire was look at all those disconnected walls along the northern border and decide they were not enough. He was going to build something that made all of them look modest. Qin Shi Huang, and the first unified wall. Qin Shi Huang was, by any measure, a person of extraordinary determination. He had unified 7 kingdoms through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and a willingness to absorb enormous losses to achieve long-term goals. He had standardized the written script used across China so that people in the far east and the far west of his new empire could read the same documents. He had standardized weights and measures, axle widths for carts, and systems of coinage. He was, in the language of modern management, extremely focused on operational consistency, and when he looked at the northern border of his new empire and saw a patchwork of old walls pointing in different directions, built to different heights, maintained to different standards, he saw a problem that needed fixing. The solution he decided on was to connect the existing walls, fill in the gaps between them, extend them westward and eastward, and raise them to a standard that would make the northern border something genuinely difficult to breach. He appointed a general named Meng Tian to oversee the project. Meng Tian was one of the most respected military commanders in the Qin Empire, and he brought to the wall project the same organizational discipline he had applied to battlefield campaigns. He set up supply lines, established construction camps at regular intervals, divided the workforce into sections responsible for specific stretches of wall, and began. The scale of what followed is difficult to fully absorb. Historical records from the period, which are fragmentary and not always reliable in their specific numbers, suggest that somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million workers were involved in Meng Tian's wall project at various points. Modern historians tend to be cautious about the higher estimates, noting that ancient record keepers sometimes used large round numbers more as expressions of magnitude than as precise counts. But even the conservative estimates represent a workforce that was, for the 3rd century before the Common Era, almost incomprehensibly large. These workers came from all parts of the newly unified empire. Soldiers were stationed along the wall and required to perform construction labour when not on active patrol. Farmers were conscripted in organised rotations, taken from their land for months at a time and sent to work on the wall. Criminals sentenced to labour, a common punishment under the Qin legal system, was sent to the most difficult and dangerous sections. And in a detail that became one of the most enduring elements of the wall's folklore, the dead were sometimes buried within the wall structure itself, not as a ritual practice, but simply because transporting bodies back to their home regions across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain was not practical. The physical experience of building the Qin wall would have been relentless. Workers in the mountain sections had to cut or quarry stone and carry it up slopes that in some places rose sharply for hundreds of meters. Workers in the flatter northern regions continued using rammed earth, but now on a scale and at a pace that required almost continuous labor. Food and water had to be brought to the construction sites, and in the more remote areas this was itself a significant logistical challenge. Workers who fell ill had very limited options for recovery. Workers who died were, as mentioned, frequently buried where they fell. The Qin wall was not identical in construction across its entire length. Different sections were built using whatever materials were locally available. In the northwest, where stone was scarce but loess soil was abundant, rammed earth continued to be the primary material. In the more mountainous sections of the north and northeast, stone was quarried and stacked. In some flat areas where neither good stone nor ideal soil was easily available, builders used whatever the landscape offered: compressed gravel, adobe blocks made from sun-dried mud, or combinations of materials layered together. The wall that Meng Tian's workers built was not what tourists photograph today. The famous image of the Great Wall, broad stone walkways on top, regular square watchtowers rising above the line of the wall, crenellated battlements of precisely cut grey brick, that image belongs to the Ming dynasty, roughly 1700 years later. The Qin wall was lower, rougher, and in many places simply a thick earthen bank with a wooden palisade on top. By modern standards it would look unimpressive, but in the context of the 3rd century before the Common Era, it was a genuinely new kind of border infrastructure, and it ran for a distance that made every earlier wall look like a garden fence. Fun fact, Qin Shi Huang was so concerned about the threat from the north that he also ordered the construction of a major road system specifically to supply and reinforce the wall. These roads, called straight roads or qidao, were some of the earliest purpose-built military highways in Chinese history. One of the main roads ran roughly north from the capital and extended toward the wall, allowing troops and supplies to be moved quickly when needed. The Romans, building their famous road network around roughly the same period on the other side of the world, would have recognized the logic immediately. The general Meng Tian spent approximately 10 years overseeing the wall project, based in the north with his army and his construction teams. He developed a reputation for harsh discipline workers who failed to meet construction standards or who attempted to leave their posts face severe punishment. But he also, according to some historical accounts, took the welfare of his workforce seriously enough to establish regular supply rotations and to protest when the central government failed to send sufficient food and materials. Whether those accounts are accurate or somewhat idealized after the fact is difficult to say. Ancient historical writing about powerful men often smoothed their edges in one direction or another. A short side story belongs here. Near the end of Qin Shi Huang's life, he became increasingly obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions to search for mythical islands in the Eastern Sea where, according to legend, an elixir of eternal life could be found. He consulted alchemists and physicians. He reportedly consumed mercury-based compounds that some of his advisors presented as longevity treatments, which almost certainly contributed to the declining mental and physical health of his final years. He died in 210 BCE while on an inspection tour of his empire, far from his capital. He was 49 years old. The empire he had spent his entire life building began to unravel almost immediately after his death, and within 4 years the Qin dynasty had collapsed entirely. Meng Tian's fate was tied to the political chaos that followed the emperor's death. He was arrested on orders from a faction at court, imprisoned, and eventually forced to take his own life. Before he died, according to a historical account recorded by the great Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, Meng Tian reflected on his own crimes and concluded that his greatest offense was not any military or political action, but the fact that in building the wall, he had cut through the earth's veins, the natural arteries of the landscape, and thereby disrupted something essential about the world. It is a remarkable statement. A general who spent a decade building one of the largest structures in human history, and who, at the end of his life, worried about what he had done to the ground. The wall that Meng Tian built ran, in rough terms, from the northeastern coastal region westward through the mountains and across the Great Bend of the Yellow River, continuing into the semi-arid northwest. Estimating its precise length is difficult because so little of the Qin wall survives above ground today, and because the wall was extended and altered significantly in later dynasties. Archaeological surveys have identified sections of rammed earth that appear to date from the Qin period in various parts of northern China, but matching all of these sections to a coherent original plan is an ongoing research project rather than a settled historical fact. What can be said with confidence is that after the Qin dynasty collapsed and the Han dynasty rose to replace it, the wall remained. The new rulers inherited it, and they faced the same northern border problems that had motivated its construction in the first place. The Xiongnu Confederation, which had been pushed back somewhat during the Qin period, had regrouped and become, if anything, more powerful during the chaos of the civil wars that ended the Qin and established the Han. The new Han emperors found themselves looking at Meng Tian's wall and thinking about what needed to be repaired, extended, and improved. The wall was now a permanent feature of the Chinese landscape, and it would remain one for the next 2,000 years. It would be neglected and rebuilt. Sections would fall and be replaced. Entire new routes would be added while old ones were abandoned. Different dynasties would interpret its purpose in different ways, as a military line, as a customs boundary, as a marker of civilization's edge, as a statement of imperial ambition, but it would never entirely disappear. Materials, methods, and construction secrets. The materials used to build the Great Wall across its many centuries of construction tell a story about Chinese geography as much as they tell a story about Chinese engineering. The wall was never built from a single consistent material because it was never built in a single consistent landscape. From the yellow loess plateaus of the northwest to the granite ridges of the northeast, the wall adapted itself to whatever the ground beneath it could offer. And the people building it developed a practical literacy about local materials that was passed down through generations of construction workers, military engineers, and government administrators. Stone was the most durable material used in the wall's construction, but it was also the most labour-intensive to obtain and transport. In the mountain sections of the northeastern wall, the sections that run through what is now Hebei and Liaoning provinces, the sections most commonly photographed and visited today, the stone is a pale grey granite that was quarried from the ridges nearby. Quarrying granite without metal explosives or power tools requires patience and ingenuity. Workers would identify natural cracks and fissures in the rock face and use iron wedges driven by hammers to split blocks along those lines. In cold climates, a technique called thermal splitting was sometimes used. Fires were lit against the rock face to heat it rapidly. Then cold water was poured on to create sudden contraction, which could split the stone along existing fault lines. Once quarried, the stone blocks had to be moved. In the mountain sections of the wall, this was a problem with no elegant solution. Pack animals, mules, donkeys and horses could carry loads up moderate slopes, but in the steeper sections they could not navigate the terrain at all. Workers developed a system of human chains, passing individual stones from person to person up the slope, or used wooden sledges and rope systems to drag larger blocks. In some accounts from the Ming Dynasty period, workers are described as using a technique of packing ice or compacted snow along a temporary pathway to allow heavy stones to slide on a low-friction surface, a method that required cold temperatures and careful timing, but could move very large blocks with relatively modest effort. Brick, rather than cut stone, was the material of choice for the Ming Dynasty builders who constructed the most recognizable sections of the wall. Ming-era bricks were made from a grey clay that was mixed, formed into blocks, and fired in kilns that were set up at temporary production sites near the construction zone. The bricks were fired at high temperatures to produce a dense, hard product that resisted moisture and crumbling better than softer, lower-fired bricks. Each brick was typically around 40 centimetres long, 20 centimetres wide, and 10 centimetres thick, roughly the size of a modern engineering brick, but somewhat more substantial in weight. The number of bricks produced for Ming wall construction was, in terms of scale, astonishing. Some estimates suggest that in particularly active construction periods, hundreds of millions of bricks were made and laid across the various sections of the wall being worked on simultaneously. Brick production required clay, fuel for the kilns, water, and labour at every stage digging and refining the clay, shaping the blocks by hand in wooden moulds, stacking and firing them in the kilns, and then transporting the finished bricks to the construction site. Each of these steps required its own organised workforce. The mortar that bound the Ming-era bricks together was where the famous sticky rice came into play. Standard lime mortar of the period was made by burning limestone in a kiln to produce quicklime, which was then slaked with water to create a paste. This lime paste was used as a binding agent between bricks and between stone blocks. The addition of glutinous rice, specifically the starchy water produced by boiling the rice, created what modern materials scientists have identified as a composite organic-inorganic binder. The amylopectin in the sticky rice filled the microscopic pores in the lime mortar as it dried, creating a denser, less permeable structure. Tests conducted by researchers from Zhejiang University in the early 2000s confirmed that ancient mortar samples from the Great Wall containing this rice compound showed significantly better resistance to compression and water penetration than comparable mortar samples without the organic component. The researchers described the result as a kind of ancient nanotechnology, the use of organic molecules at a microscopic scale to improve the performance of a construction material. The builders of the Ming Dynasty did not have electron microscopes or materials science laboratories. They had generations of accumulated practical knowledge, and they knew from experience that the rice mortar worked better, even if they could not have explained exactly why. Dry, humorous comparison. Today, If you wanted to build a structure with that level of materials engineering precision, you would hire a team of consultants, commission a laboratory study, and wait 18 months for the report. In the Ming dynasty, they just boiled rice and mixed it in, and it worked for 500 years. The foundation systems used in Great Wall construction varied considerably with terrain. On flat ground, the wall's foundation was often simply a widened base of the same material as the rest of the wall. Extra courses of stone or brick buried below grade to distribute the load and resist frost heave. In mountain terrain, the challenge was more complex. Where the wall crosses a ridgeline, the foundation has to deal with the slope on both sides, uneven rock surfaces, and in many places the complete absence of any flat ground to build on. Ming-era builders in the mountain sections developed a technique of cutting stepped foundations directly into the bedrock, carving horizontal ledges into the rock face, and then building the base courses of the wall on those ledges rather than on loose surface soil. This stepped foundation approach can still be seen in sections of the wall that have been studied by archaeologists and conservators. The lower courses of stone are precisely fitted to the irregular surface of the underlying rock in a way that suggests careful observation and skilled cutting. The fit is not perfect, there are gaps and irregularities, but it is good enough that the wall has remained stable on some extremely steep and uneven ground for more than 4 centuries. A short side story belongs here. During the construction of one of the mountain sections of the wall in the Ming dynasty period, a foreman named Yi Kaizan, a figure mentioned in regional historical records, was reportedly responsible for calculating exactly how many bricks would be needed for a particular section. He calculated the number down to a single brick, telling his supervisors that 1 extra brick would be needed as a spare. His supervisors, skeptical, ordered that exactly the number of bricks he specified be delivered. When construction was complete, 1 brick remained, exactly as he had predicted. That spare brick, according to the local tradition, was placed at one of the gate structures in the section he had overseen, where it reportedly remained visible for centuries afterward. Whether this story is literal history or a later embellishment, celebrating the precision of a skilled craftsman is uncertain. But it captures something true about the wall's construction. The level of planning and calculation that went into each section was far greater than casual observers usually assume. The drainage systems built into the wall are another aspect of its construction that receives far less attention than the more dramatic elements, but represents genuinely sophisticated engineering. A stone and brick wall of significant height, sitting on a mountain ridge and exposed to rain, snowmelt, and freeze-thaw cycles, accumulates enormous amounts of water pressure within and behind its structure. Without drainage, this water would saturate the fill material inside the wall, freeze and expand in winter, and eventually push the facing stones apart from behind. Ming-era builders addressed this with carved stone drainage channels, small rectangular openings in the lower courses of the outer facing, positioned at regular intervals that allowed water to flow through and out rather than accumulating. These drainage openings, called Paoshui Zuizi in Chinese, which translates roughly as water spouting mouths, are visible in many surviving sections of the wall. They were positioned based on observed water flow patterns on each particular section of the ridge. A section where water tended to pool behind the wall on the inner face might have drainage openings placed lower and more frequently than a section where the terrain naturally shed water away. This kind of site-specific engineering judgment, applied consistently across hundreds of miles of varying terrain, required not just technical knowledge, but the ability to read the landscape and anticipate how water would behave in different seasons and weather conditions. The inner core of the Ming-era wall, the material between the outer brick or stone faces, was typically a compacted fill of rubble, broken brick, lime, and earth. This core was not as mechanically strong as the facing materials, but it was dense and heavy, contributing to the mass of the structure in a way that resisted lateral pressure and provided thermal stability. In winter, the dense core cooled and warmed slowly, meaning that temperature fluctuations at the surface did not immediately translate into structural movement deep within the wall. Fun fact: the total amount of material used to construct all the various phases of the Great Wall across its entire history has been estimated by some researchers to be sufficient to build a wall 8 meters high and 1 meter thick all the way around the Earth at the equator. This estimate is not precise. It involves significant assumptions about the density and completeness of various wall sections, but it conveys something about the cumulative scale of the construction effort across more than 2,000 years. The tools used by wall builders were, by modern standards, remarkably simple. Iron chisels, hammers, and picks for cutting stone, wooden molds for forming bricks, hemp ropes for lifting and dragging loads, wooden scaffolding for working at height, bamboo baskets for carrying loose material, hand-cranked winches for raising heavy blocks short vertical distances. None of these tools would look out of place in a pre-industrial construction site anywhere in the world. The ingenuity was not in the tools themselves, but in the organizational systems that coordinated hundreds of thousands of people using those tools simultaneously across a construction zone that stretched for hundreds of miles. The Han, Sui, and Ming dynasties rebuilding through centuries. When the Han dynasty stabilized China after the collapse of the Qin, the new rulers inherited an empire that was still geographically enormous but politically exhausted. The civil wars that had ended the Qin had disrupted agriculture, depopulated entire regions, and left the administrative machinery of the state in need of significant repair. The Han emperors had many problems to address simultaneously, and the northern border was near the top of that list. The Xiongnu Confederation, which occupied the steppe lands beyond the wall, had grown significantly in power during the years of Chinese internal conflict. The early Han court, recognizing that a direct military confrontation with the Xiongnu was not yet practical, adopted a policy of strategic accommodation, sending diplomatic missions, arranging marriages between Han imperial women and Xiongnu leaders, and providing annual payments of silk, grain, and other goods in exchange for relative peace on the border. This policy, called Hekqin in Chinese, was effective in reducing large-scale raids but was not universally popular at the Han court. Some officials and military commanders argued that paying the Xiongnu was simply rewarding aggression and would only encourage more demands. The debate about how to handle the northern border through accommodation or through military assertion ran through the entire first century of Han rule and was never entirely resolved. What the Han did do, consistently and at considerable expense, was maintain and extend the wall that the Qin had built, because even during periods of diplomatic calm, a physical border infrastructure that could monitor movement, collect intelligence, and slow down any sudden resumption of raiding was considered worth maintaining. The Han extensions to the wall pushed significantly further west than the Qin construction had reached. The Qin wall had ended roughly at the Great Bend of the Yellow River, in the region of what is now Inner Mongolia. The Han extended the wall system westward into the Hexi Corridor, a long, narrow strip of habitable land running between the Tibetan Plateau to the south and the Gobi Desert to the north, and eventually all the way to the Yumen Pass near the edge of what is now Gansu province. This westward extension was not just a defensive measure. It was also a strategic corridor that protected the early routes of what would later become known as the Silk Road, the network of overland trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean world. The Han Wall in the western sections was built primarily from rammed earth and from a locally available material called tamarisk, a shrubby tree whose branches and dried reeds were layered alternately with compacted earth and gravel to create a laminated structure that had more tensile strength than plain rammed earth alone. This layered construction technique, sometimes compared in modern materials terms to a primitive form of composite building, produced walls that survived the extremely dry desert climate of the northwest remarkably well. Sections of Han-era wall in the Gansu region have been identified by archaeologists and, despite being more than 2,000 years old, retain their basic form. because the near absence of rainfall in that environment means that erosion has been minimal. The Han also established a sophisticated system of beacon towers and garrison forts along the wall, particularly in the western sections. These towers were positioned at intervals of roughly 5 to 10 miles, each one in sight of the next, and each one staffed by a small detachment of soldiers whose primary responsibilities were observation, communication, and the maintenance of supplies. Archaeological excavations at Han-era sites along the western wall line have recovered remarkable quantities of written documents, strips of wood and bamboo with ink-brushed text, recording military orders, supply requests, personnel records, and private correspondence from soldiers to their families. These documents give an unusually intimate picture of daily life on the frontier during the Han period. Fun fact, one of the Han-era wooden documents recovered from a frontier site includes what appears to be a soldier's complaint about the quality of the food being sent to his garrison. The document, which dates to roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, describes the rations as insufficient and requests that more grain be delivered before winter. The specific concerns of a soldier stationed on a remote section of the Chinese frontier 2,000 years ago are, in some ways, entirely recognizable. After the Han dynasty fragmented in the 3rd century of the Common Era, China entered a long period of political division. Various successor states controlled different regions, and wall construction continued sporadically, depending on which state controlled a given section of the northern border and whether that state had the resources and political stability to invest in large infrastructure projects. The Northern Wei dynasty, a state founded by a people called the Xianbei who had themselves migrated from the steppe, built and repaired walls along the northern border during the 4th and 5th centuries, an interesting situation in which people who were culturally related to the nomadic groups the wall was meant to keep out were now building the wall themselves as settled rulers of a Chinese-style state. The Sui dynasty, which briefly reunified China in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, undertook one of the most intensive periods of wall construction and repair outside of the Ming dynasty. The Sui Emperor Yang Jian and his son and successor Yang Guang both invested heavily in the northern border infrastructure, mobilizing very large workforces for construction campaigns that extended and repaired the wall across multiple sections simultaneously. The Sui wall projects were infamous for their human cost. Historical records describe mass conscription that removed enormous numbers of men from agricultural communities, causing food production to fall and contributing to the social instability that eventually brought down the Sui dynasty after only 37 years in power. The Sui is remembered in Chinese history partly as a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-ambitious construction programs that consume more resources than the state can actually sustain. Dry, humorous comparison. The Sui dynasty's approach to infrastructure investment: build everything at maximum scale simultaneously regardless of cost. Then discover that you have run out of both money and public goodwill is a pattern that has not entirely disappeared from the history of large construction projects. The Tang dynasty that followed the Sui took a notably different approach to the northern border. The Tang military was strong enough, and its diplomatic relationships with the northern peoples were sophisticated enough that the Tang largely abandoned the policy of building and maintaining walls in favor of direct military engagement and alliance building with steppe confederations. The Great Wall during the Tang period was largely neglected, and sections that had been repaired under the Sui began to deteriorate again. The Tang court's attitude toward the wall was essentially that a strong army and smart diplomacy were more effective border management tools than a static physical barrier. This was arguably correct, at least for as long as the Tang remained militarily dominant. A short side story belongs here. A Tang dynasty poet named Wang Changling wrote a series of poems about soldiers stationed on the frontier that became some of the most celebrated military verses in the Chinese literary tradition. One of his poems describes a soldier standing at a watchtower on the border at night, looking out at the moonlit landscape and thinking about his home thousands of miles to the south. The poem does not describe the wall directly, it describes the feeling of being stationed at the edge of the known world, far from family and warmth, watching a border that never entirely settled into peace. Wang Changling's frontier poems were read and memorized by educated Chinese people for more than 1,000 years after he wrote them, and they shaped the cultural image of the wall as a place of loneliness and endurance as much as any historical chronicle. The wall's most dramatic reinvention came during the Ming dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644. The Ming came to power after a period of Mongol rule, the Yuan dynasty. Established by Kublai Khan after the Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century, and the experience of having been governed by people from the steppe for nearly a century, made the Ming emperors extremely focused on northern border security. The Mongols had not been kept out by any wall, because the wall systems of the Song and earlier periods had been allowed to deteriorate, and because Mongol military tactics were sophisticated enough to bypass or simply ignore fixed fortifications, the Ming were determined not to repeat that vulnerability. What the Ming built was, in almost every sense, a new wall. They did not simply repair or extend what earlier dynasties had constructed. In many sections, they chose entirely new routes, surveying the terrain more carefully than any previous dynasty had done, and selecting paths that maximized visibility, minimized the areas of dead ground where an approaching force could hide, and positioned the wall along the most defensible ridgelines available. The Ming wall system was also broader and more complex than anything that had come before, incorporating not just the main wall but a network of secondary walls, isolated towers, fortified passes, and garrison towns that together formed a layered defensive zone rather than a single line. The Ming construction effort was organized along what historians describe as a sectoral system. The entire length of the wall under Ming control was divided into 9 defensive sectors, each one the responsibility of a specific military command. Each sector had its own garrison troops, its own supply chain, its own engineering staff, and its own construction program. This decentralized structure meant that construction and repair could proceed in multiple places simultaneously, without requiring coordination from the central government for every decision. It also meant that the quality of construction varied somewhat between sectors, depending on the resources and administrative efficiency of the local command. The 9 Ming defensive sectors produced the walls that most people think of today when they imagine the Great Wall of China. Mutianyu, Badaling, Jinshanling, Simatai. These sections, now the most visited and photographed, are all products of the Ming construction programs of the 15th and 16th centuries, built by workers using fired brick, cut stone, and the rice compound mortar that has kept them standing to the present day. Watchtowers, signal fires, and the communication system. The watchtowers of the Great Wall are among the most architecturally distinctive structures in the entire history of Chinese building. They rise at irregular intervals along the wall's length, sometimes spaced a few hundred meters apart, sometimes separated by a mile or more, depending on the terrain and the visibility conditions of a particular section. Each one was a small, self-contained fortress, designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously, as an observation post, as a shelter for a small garrison of soldiers, as a storage facility for weapons and supplies, and as a node in a communication network that stretched for hundreds of miles in each direction. The standard Ming-era watchtower was a rectangular structure built from the same grey-fired brick as the wall itself. A typical tower rose to roughly 12 meters in height above the wall's walkway surface, which itself might already be 8 or 10 meters above the surrounding ground level on a steep ridge. From the top of a watchtower on a clear day, a soldier could see across a very substantial distance of the surrounding landscape, scanning the steppe to the north for movement, dust clouds, or any of the other visual signals that indicated approaching riders or a gathering military force. The interior of a watchtower was divided into 2 or sometimes 3 levels. The lower level, accessible from a door set into the wall's walkway rather than from outside the wall, served as living and storage space for the garrison. Soldiers slept, ate, and kept their equipment here. Supplies of food, water, firewood, and military materials were stored in this lower space, along with the specific materials needed for signal-making bundles of dried wolf dung, wooden signal flags of different colours, and stores of sulphur and other smoke-producing materials. The upper level of the tower, accessed by an internal staircase, was the observation platform, an open or partially enclosed space with embrasures cut into the walls through which soldiers could look out in multiple directions. The signal system that connected these towers was one of the most sophisticated pre-modern long-distance communication networks in human history. Its basic principle was simple. A signal made at one tower would be seen by the garrison of the next tower, who would repeat the signal, which would then be seen by the tower beyond that, and so on down the line. A message could travel hundreds of miles in the time it took to light and observe a succession of fires and smoke signals. The specific codes used varied by dynasty and by sector, but the Ming system involved combinations of smoke signals by day and fire signals by night, with the number of fires or smoke columns indicating both the urgency and the nature of the threat being reported. The use of wolf dung in signal fires is one of the more memorable details of Great Wall history. Wolf dung, when dried and burned, produces a column of dark smoke that rises more vertically and remains coherent over a greater height than most other combustible materials available on the northern frontier. In the open, often windy conditions of the northern Chinese highlands, a smoke signal that dispersed horizontally within a few meters of its source would be nearly impossible to distinguish from the background at any significant distance. A tall, vertical column of dense dark smoke was visible from many miles away under good atmospheric conditions. The soldiers manning the towers collected, dried, and stored wolf dung specifically for this purpose, and military supply records from the Ming period include regular deliveries of dried wolf dung to frontier garrisons as a standard logistics item. The signal codes in the Ming system were formalized in military regulations. One smoke column by day or one fire by night indicated that an enemy force of up to 500 riders had been sighted. Two signals indicated a force of up to 3,000. Three signals indicated a major invasion force of more than 5,000. 4 or 5 simultaneous signals were the most urgent designation, indicating an overwhelming threat requiring immediate response from the nearest major garrison. Each combination of signals also carried information about the direction of the threat, allowing the commanders at the major fortress towns behind the wall to begin mobilizing troops and routing reinforcements before the approaching enemy had even reached the wall itself. The speed at which this system could transmit information was genuinely remarkable by pre-modern standards. Military records from the Ming period describe situations in which a signal originated at a frontier tower in the early morning and was received at a major command center hundreds of miles away before midday. Information that would have taken a galloping horseman several days to carry was communicated in hours. The wall signal system was not just a defensive barrier, it was an information network, and the towers were its nodes. The soldiers who lived and worked in these towers occupied one of the more difficult postings in the Ming military. Tower garrisons were typically small, between 5 and 12 men, depending on the size and strategic importance of the tower. They were responsible for their own food production to a significant degree, maintaining small gardens or keeping animals near the tower, supplemented by periodic supply deliveries from the larger garrison towns. They were also responsible for the maintenance of the tower itself, repointing mortar that had cracked, replacing drainage stones that had shifted, clearing vegetation that was beginning to force its way into the wall structure. The isolation of tower duty was significant. A garrison of 8 men stationed at a tower on a remote mountain ridge might go weeks or months between visits from any higher military authority. They corresponded with their superiors through written reports delivered by messenger, and they maintained daily logs of what they had observed, noting the weather, recording any unusual activity on the northern side of the wall, and documenting the condition of their supplies and equipment. Many of these logbooks have been lost, but some survive in fragmentary form in Chinese historical archives, and they paint a picture of daily frontier life that was overwhelmingly composed of routine observation, maintenance work, and waiting. A short side story belongs here. A Ming Dynasty soldier named Chen Wuji, whose name appears in a set of frontier records discovered in the 20th century in a provincial archive, kept a personal notebook alongside his official logbook during a posting at a tower section in the northern mountains. The official log recorded enemy sightings, supply levels, and weather conditions in the standardized format required by military regulations. The personal notebook contained something quite different: records of the birds he had observed from the tower top, detailed notes about which plants grew on the sunny south face of the ridge versus the shadowed north face, descriptions of the way light changed on the mountain landscape at different hours of the day, and occasional short poems written in an unpracticed but genuine style. Chen Wuji spent 3 years at that tower posting. His official log was a document of military discipline. His personal notebook was a document of a human being finding something worth paying attention to, in a landscape that most of his contemporaries regarded simply as a border. The architectural form of the watchtowers was not identical across all sections of the wall. In the eastern mountain sections, towers tended to be solid and square in plan, with relatively small internal spaces and thick walls that provided both structural strength and thermal mass, keeping the interior warmer in winter and cooler in summer than the exposed walkway surface. In the flatter western sections, where the terrain offered less natural protection and where the threat of cavalry attack was more direct, towers were sometimes larger and more complex in plan, with additional rooms and storage capacity that reflected the need to maintain a larger garrison and more substantial supplies in areas that were harder to reinforce quickly. Some of the larger fortified passes along the wall points where a road or valley provided a natural crossing point through the mountain barrier were protected by tower complexes of considerably greater size and architectural elaboration than the standard frontier watchtower. The pass at Juyongguan, northwest of what is now Beijing, was protected by a series of walls within walls, gates within gates, and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of observation and fire. A force attempting to breach this pass would have faced not a single line of defense but a layered system in which breaching the outer wall simply placed them inside a killing ground overlooked by further defensive positions. Fun fact, the central platform at Juyongguan Pass, called the Cloud Terrace and dating from the Yuan dynasty period in the mid-1300s, is decorated with carved stone reliefs showing Buddhist figures, Dharani inscriptions in 6 different scripts, and celestial guardians. This religious and artistic decoration on a military structure reflects the complex cultural layering of the Yuan period, when Chinese, Mongol, Tibetan, and Central Asian cultural traditions were all present simultaneously in the capital region. The Cloud Terrace was essentially a religious monument inserted into a military checkpoint, serving simultaneously as a blessing on travellers passing through the gate and as a statement of the cosmopolitan ambitions of its Mongol imperial patrons. The maintenance of the watchtowers was a constant and expensive obligation. Brick structures in a mountain environment face continuous assault from freeze-thaw cycles, from the roots of plants that find their way into mortar joints, and from the simple mechanical stress of settling on an uneven and occasionally unstable ridge. Ming military records contain repeated references to the need for repair work on specific towers, and archaeological surveys of wall sections today reveal a complex stratigraphy of repair and rebuilding original Ming-era brickwork overlaid with later Qing dynasty, repairs overlaid with 20th century conservation work, each phase using slightly different materials and slightly different techniques. The drainage systems of the towers mirrored those of the wall itself, with carved stone channels and deliberately sloped floor surfaces designed to move water away from the interior spaces and out through the outer walls. In towers where these drainage systems have remained functional, the interior masonry is in remarkably good condition despite centuries of exposure. In towers where the drainage systems have become blocked or damaged, which is a significant proportion of surviving towers, The interior walls show the characteristic staining and spalling of prolonged water damage, and in some cases the interior floors have settled or collapsed entirely. The signal fire system fell out of regular use in the late Ming period as the dynasty's military power weakened, and the Manchu forces that would eventually establish the Qing dynasty began to probe the northern border with increasing frequency and success. The system had been designed for a military situation in which the wall was actively garrisoned and maintained, and as the garrisons became understaffed and undersupplied in the late Ming years, the communication network they were meant to operate became unreliable. By the time the Qing dynasty established itself in 1644, the signal fire system as a functioning military tool had largely been abandoned. The towers remained standing, but the coordinated intelligence network they'd been built to support was gone. The wall's geometry, landscape, and engineering logic. There is a common assumption that the Great Wall of China runs in a roughly straight line from east to west across the top of China, like a seam stitched along the border between the agricultural south and the nomadic north. This assumption is understandable. On small-scale maps, the wall does appear as something like a continuous line running horizontally across the upper portion of the Chinese landmass. But when you look at detailed maps, or when you walk any significant section of the wall itself, the reality is entirely different. The wall does not run straight. It curves, doubles back, climbs steeply, descends sharply, splits into parallel branches, widens into fortified enclosures, and in some places runs in directions that seem to have nothing to do with east or west at all. The reason for this is simple and fundamental. The wall was never designed by someone sitting at a desk drawing lines on a map. It was designed by engineers and military commanders who were standing in the landscape itself, looking at the actual ground, and making decisions based on what the terrain offered and demanded. The geometry of the wall is, in a very direct sense, the geometry of the landscape it crosses. Every curve, every ascent, every unexpected change of direction corresponds to something real about the mountains, valleys, rivers, and soil conditions of northern China. The basic engineering principle that governed the routing of the wall was the concept of controlling high ground. A wall sitting on a ridgeline commands the landscape on both sides. Soldiers standing on the walkway can see a very long distance in the direction of the potential threat, and any force approaching the wall from the outside must climb uphill to reach it, which slows movement, exhausts attackers, and exposes them to observation and missile fire from above. A wall built in a valley, by contrast, can be approached across flat ground, overlooks nothing, and provides no particular defensive advantage. Given a choice between routing the wall across a difficult ridgeline or a convenient valley, Ming-era military engineers almost always chose the ridgeline. This preference for high ground produced some of the most visually dramatic sections of the wall. Those photographs that show the structure climbing nearly vertically up a mountain face, with staircases so steep they are closer to ladders, the wall's silhouette cutting across a sky that seems impossibly far above the valley floor. These sections exist not because the builders were indifferent to the difficulty of construction on extreme slopes, but because the military logic of controlling that particular ridgeline was considered worth the additional construction cost and labour. The relationship between the wall and water is another aspect of its routing logic that is not immediately obvious. Water in northern China is not evenly distributed. Rivers cut through the mountain ranges in specific valleys, and those river valleys are inevitably the points where passage through the mountains is easiest both for trade and for military movement. The wall had to address these valleys in a particular way, because a gap in the wall at a river crossing was an obvious vulnerability. The solution was not to try to dam or block the rivers, which was neither practical nor desirable, but to build the wall across the river at a designated crossing point, and then construct a fortified gate at that crossing, equipped with a portcullis or heavy timber gate that could be lowered to block the water passage during a military emergency. These water gates, called shuimen in Chinese, were architecturally interesting structures that combined masonry, arch construction, with iron or timber grille elements. The masonry arch allowed the river to pass through the base of the wall while maintaining structural continuity in the wall above. The grille or gate element, suspended above the normal water level, could be dropped quickly to prevent boats or swimmers from passing through during an alarm. Some larger river crossings had multiple parallel arches spanning the full width of the river, with gate elements in each arch. The engineering challenge of building a masonry arch foundation in a live river using the construction technology of the 15th and 16th centuries was considerable, and the water gates that survive today are among the more technically impressive elements of the entire wall system. The width of the wall's walkway surface varied considerably between sections, but the Ming-era standard in the most heavily constructed sections was roughly 4 to 5 meters wide, enough for 5 soldiers to walk abreast, or for 2 horses to pass each other. This width was not arbitrary. The walkway needed to be wide enough to allow troops and supplies to move along the wall quickly during an emergency, effectively using the wall itself as a military road running parallel to the frontier. The idea of the wall as a transport corridor, as well as a defensive barrier, was built into its design from the beginning of the Ming construction program. The crenellations along the top of the outer face of the wall, the notched battlements that appear in every photograph, were sized and positioned to serve specific tactical functions. The merlons, the solid portions of the battlement, were roughly 1 meter wide and about 1.5 meters tall above the walkway surface. The crenelles, the open gaps between merlons, were roughly 0.5 meter wide. A soldier crouching behind a merlon was protected from direct fire. A soldier using a crenelle to observe or shoot was exposed, but only through a narrow opening that made targeting him difficult from the outside. The spacing of merlons and crenelles was calibrated to allow a line of soldiers standing at regular intervals to each have a crenelle to use, while maintaining cover between those positions. The inner face of the wall, the side facing into Chinese territory, was typically lower than the outer face, with a parapet of roughly 1 meter rather than the full battlement height of the outer face. This asymmetry was deliberate. A lower inner parapet meant that soldiers standing on the walkway were exposed from behind if the wall was breached and attackers gained the walkway, but it also meant that supporting fire from troops standing on the ground behind the wall was not obstructed. The defensive calculus prioritized the primary threat attack from outside, while accepting some vulnerability from behind. The staircases built into steep sections of the wall are one of its most physically demanding features. On gradients that would simply be too steep for a continuous flat walkway, the surface of the wall is interrupted by steps, but steps calibrated to a military rather than a civilian purpose. The riser height of these steps is typically quite high, often 30 centimeters or more, and the treads are sometimes quite shallow. Walking up a long, steep section of Ming-era staircase in the wall is a significant physical effort, even for a fit person carrying nothing. Soldiers carrying weapons, armor, and supplies would have found these sections genuinely punishing. The reason for the steep step design is not indifference to the soldier's comfort. It is that on a slope of significant gradient, the only alternative to steep steps is a ramp, and a ramp on a steep slope would be dangerously slippery in wet or icy conditions. Steps, however uncomfortable, provide grip. Dry, humorous comparison. Modern building codes in most countries would require handrails on any staircase of this gradient, regular rest landings at specified intervals, and a slip-resistant surface treatment. The Ming dynasty provided none of these things, presumably on the grounds that soldiers who were going to be defending a mountain fortress against a cavalry army could manage a steep staircase without assistance. The towers and gates of the wall were also positioned with careful attention to what military engineers call dead ground areas of the landscape that cannot be seen from a given observation point because of the shape of the terrain. Dead ground is a vulnerability in any defensive system, because an enemy who reaches dead ground is invisible to the defenders and can concentrate forces or prepare an assault without being observed or targeted. Ming-era engineers minimized dead ground by positioning towers at points where their lines of sight overlapped the area visible from one tower extended past the edge of the dead ground of the adjacent tower, and vice versa. This overlapping visibility pattern meant that, in theory, any point on the landscape within range of the wall was visible from at least one tower at all times. In practice, the overlapping visibility was not always achievable. In heavily folded mountain terrain, the geometry of sightlines becomes extremely complex, and there were inevitably some points where the terrain created pockets of dead ground that the tower placement could not fully eliminate. Military engineers noted these vulnerabilities in their surveys, and in some cases, additional smaller observation towers or signal positions were constructed specifically to cover areas of dead ground that the main tower network could not see. The attention to the geometry of vision to the question of what can be seen from where and what cannot was one of the more sophisticated aspects of the wall's military planning. The wall's path through the landscape also reflected a careful reading of the seasonal behavior of the northern steppe environment. The nomadic groups who represented the primary military threat to the northern border did not move randomly. Their patterns of movement followed the seasonal availability of water and pasture predictable enough that Chinese military planners could make reasonable estimates about where and when large-scale movement was most likely to occur. The routing of the wall was partly shaped by these predictions, with the most heavily constructed and garrisoned sections positioned at the points where the terrain naturally channeled movement and where the historical record of raids suggested the most frequent pressure. Fun fact: some sections of the Great Wall were deliberately built with a slight inward curve on the outer face, a technique borrowed from earlier Chinese city wall construction. A straight vertical wall face, when hit at the base by an attacking force using battering rams or simply by the weight of people pressing against it, transmits the impact force directly upward through the structure. A face that curves slightly inward at the top deflects some of this force outward, reducing the likelihood of a clean vertical collapse. This subtle curve is not always visible to the naked eye in surviving sections, but structural surveys of Ming-era wall sections have documented it in multiple locations. The geometry of the wall also has an astronomical dimension that is rarely discussed. The orientation of the wall in certain sections, particularly the long, relatively straight sections in the flatter northern regions, aligns quite precisely with the cardinal directions, suggesting that the original survey was conducted using astronomical methods rather than just physical observation of the terrain. Chinese surveyors of the Han and Ming periods had access to sophisticated astronomical instruments and well-developed methods for determining true north from stellar observation. Some researchers have suggested that the use of astronomical alignment in wall surveying served both practical purposes, ensuring consistent orientation across large distances in flat terrain, and symbolic ones, connecting the physical border of the empire to the cosmological order that underpinned imperial Chinese thought. The wall's path is also, in several places, deliberately discontinuous. Gaps were left in the wall at certain points, not because construction was never completed, but because the terrain itself provided an equivalent barrier, a cliff face so steep that it was considered impassable by any attacking force, a river gorge so deep and narrow that no army could cross it in tactically useful numbers. At these natural barrier points, the wall was simply not built, and the natural feature was considered sufficient. This integration of natural and constructed elements into a single coherent defensive system reflected a mature engineering intelligence about the landscape, the recognition that the goal was not to build a wall everywhere, but to create a continuous barrier using whatever combination of natural and constructed elements would achieve that goal most effectively. Legends, folklore, and the human stories inside the stone. Every structure built by large numbers of people over a very long period of time accumulates stories, not the official stories recorded in government documents and military reports, but the other kind, the stories that move through communities by word of mouth, that get attached to particular places and particular stones, that explain things that the official record does not bother to explain or cannot explain. The Great Wall has accumulated more of these stories than almost any other structure in the world, partly because of its age, partly because of its scale, and partly because of the human cost of its construction, which was high enough and visible enough that it demanded some form of cultural processing. Whether any physical bones are actually embedded in the Great Wall is a question that has attracted genuine archaeological attention. The historical accounts of workers being buried within or beneath the wall structure are plausible given what is known about the conditions of construction and the logistical difficulty of transporting bodies over long distances. Archaeological excavations near sections of the wall have indeed found human remains in proximity to the wall structure. Though the interpretation of these findings is complex, it is not always clear whether remains were intentionally placed within the wall or simply came to rest near it through other processes. No major excavation has yet produced clear evidence of systematic intentional burial within the wall fabric itself, but the question has not been conclusively settled. The folklore surrounding the wall also includes a rich tradition of stories about the supernatural properties of certain sections. Particular gates and passes were believed to be guarded by divine beings who could protect travellers passing through them in the right spirit or punish those who approached with ill intent. Some sections of the wall in remote mountain areas were associated with stories of ghosts, the spirits of workers who had died during construction and had not received proper burial rites, and who therefore remained attached to the place of their death. Local communities living near these sections sometimes maintained small shrine structures or performed periodic ritual observances at the wall's base, directed at placating or honouring these lingering presences. The Watchtowers, standing empty after the decline of the Ming garrison system, developed their own folklore. A tower standing alone on a high ridge, visible for miles across a mountain landscape, its interior dark and its upper levels open to the wind, naturally attracted stories about what happened inside it at night. Travellers passing below such towers after dark reported sounds whined through the drainage openings, the settling of old masonry, the movement of animals that had taken up residence in the protected interior spaces that imagination and darkness transformed into something else. The towers became, in local folk tradition, places where the boundary between the everyday world and some other condition of existence was thinner than usual. A short side story belongs here. In the 1980s, a team of researchers from a Beijing university conducting a survey of remote wall sections in the mountains of Hebei province spent several nights camped inside a Ming-era watchtower that had not been visited by any documented research team in decades. They were there to document the architectural condition of the tower and the section of wall it was part of, taking measurements and photographs and making condition assessments. On their second night, one of the researchers heard a repeated knocking sound from the lower level of the tower below where the team was sleeping. Investigation revealed that a family of stone martens, a small, agile mammal related to weasels, had established a den in a gap between the wall's inner facing and its rubble core, and were moving in and out through a crack in the lower masonry. The researchers noted in their field report, with some evident amusement, that the sound had been genuinely unsettling in the dark of a mountain night, and that their first several hypotheses about its source had been considerably less mundane than the actual explanation. The cultural significance of the wall extended well beyond China's own borders relatively early in the country's engagement with foreign visitors and observers. The Jesuit missionaries who travelled to China in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, gaining access to the Ming court through their expertise in mathematics, astronomy and cartography, wrote about the wall in letters and reports that circulated in Europe and contributed to the growing European image of China as a civilization of extraordinary antiquity and scale. One of the most influential of these accounts was written by a Flemish Jesuit named Ferdinand Verbiest, who visited sections of the wall in the 1670s and described its dimensions and construction in terms that his European readers found almost unbelievable. The stories European writers and travellers told about the wall were not always accurate. The idea that the Great Wall was visible from the moon, a claim that circulated widely in Western popular culture from roughly the 19th century onward, is almost certainly false. The wall is, in its widest sections, about 9 meters across, from the surface of the moon at a distance of roughly 384,000 kilometers, resolving an object 9 meters wide would require eyesight approximately 17,000 times more acute than normal human vision. The claim has been repeated so many times in so many contexts that it became one of those facts that everyone knows without anyone having verified it. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei, who became the first Chinese person in space in 2003, reported after his orbital flight that he had looked for the wall and could not see it. The story, charming as it is, does not survive contact with basic optics. Fun fact: the Great Wall appears on the obverse side of a series of Chinese commemorative gold and silver coins issued from the 1980s onward. It also appeared on the reverse of the 1 yuan banknote in various periods of Chinese currency history, making it one of the most reproduced images in the world simply by virtue of the scale of Chinese currency circulation. The human stories embedded in the wall are not only stories of suffering and loss, though those are certainly present. There are also stories of craft and pride. The bricks used in Ming-era wall construction were often stamped or inscribed before firing with the name of the kiln that produced them, the name of the official responsible for that production run, and sometimes the name of the section of wall where that batch of bricks was to be delivered. This marking system was not primarily intended to last for centuries as a historical record. It was a quality control mechanism. If a section of wall built with a particular batch of bricks failed or showed defects, the inscriptions on the bricks allowed authorities to trace the problem back to its source and hold the responsible parties accountable. The marking system meant that every brick in the wall carried with it a chain of human accountability. Researchers studying the brick inscriptions of the Ming Wall have found that the naming conventions evolved over the construction period. Early inscriptions tended to record only official titles and locations. Later inscriptions sometimes included the personal names of individual workers, the people who actually mixed the clay, formed the blocks, and carried them to the kilns. Whether this shift represented a changing attitude toward the acknowledgement of individual labour, or simply an evolution in record-keeping practices, is not entirely clear. But the result is that certain surviving sections of the Ming Wall contain bricks inscribed with the names of ordinary working people, farmers turned construction labourers, brickmakers, kiln operators whose names would otherwise have been lost entirely to history. The wall's most intimate human stories are perhaps the least dramatic ones. The graffiti scratched into plaster and mortar surfaces by bored soldiers during long garrison postings. The small personal objects, hairpins, coins, fragments of clothing recovered during archaeological work near tower foundations. The ink-brushed characters found on interior wall surfaces in sheltered sections, recording dates, names, and the occasional observation about the weather or the state of supplies. These fragments of ordinary human presence accumulate into something larger than any single story. They are the evidence that the wall was not just a construction project, or a military system, or a symbol of imperial ambition. It was, for the people who built it and lived on it and maintained it across 2,000 years, a place where ordinary life continued to happen, one day at a time, in a landscape that was often cold, often isolated, and occasionally, in the early morning light on a mountain ridge with a clear sky overhead, genuinely beautiful. When the Qing dynasty established itself as the ruling power of China in 1644, the new rulers faced an interesting relationship with the Great Wall. The Qing emperors were Manchu people from the northeast whose own ancestors had lived beyond the wall, on the steppe side of the barrier. The Manchu had spent decades probing the weaknesses of the late Ming defensive system before finally breaching it, not by overwhelming military force at a defended point, but by being invited through one of the major gates by a Ming general who had decided that cooperation with the Manchu was preferable to continued loyalty to a dynasty he felt had treated him unfairly. The wall, in the end, was not defeated. It was bypassed through human politics, which is perhaps the most honest assessment of the limits of any purely physical defensive system. The Qing emperors, having come to power partly because the wall had failed to keep them out, had little strategic interest in maintaining it as a military installation. The northern border situation under the Qing was fundamentally different from anything the Ming had faced. The Qing maintained direct political and military relationships with the Mongol peoples of the steppe through a sophisticated system of alliances, intermarriages, and institutional arrangements that made the steppe a partner of the empire rather than a threat to it. The wall, which had been built to defend against exactly that threat, was now strategically irrelevant. Qing military attention shifted to different frontiers: the southwest, the west, the southeast coast, and the northern wall was allowed to fall out of active maintenance. The deterioration that followed was gradual but relentless. The garrison towns behind the wall depopulated as the military rationale for their existence disappeared. The watchtowers, no longer staffed, became shelters for animals and storage for local farmers. The brick facing of the wall, that high-quality fired grey brick that had taken such enormous effort to produce and lay, became an enormously convenient source of free building material for the communities living in the wall's vicinity. Farmers disassembled sections of the wall to build houses, field walls, pigsties, and grain stores. Local governments used wall bricks for civic construction. In some areas, entire sections of wall were systematically demolished for their material over a period of decades, leaving nothing but the earthen core exposed, which then eroded relatively quickly in the seasonal rains. This process of material salvage was not vandalism in the eyes of the communities engaged in it. The wall, from the perspective of a farming family living a few miles from a section of abandoned military infrastructure in the 17th or 18th century, was simply a source of excellent building material that nobody was using. The bricks were well fired, consistent in size, and far superior to anything a small rural community could produce for itself. Taking them was practical, not destructive. The fact that those bricks were part of one of the largest construction projects in human history was not a consideration that had any practical weight in the daily calculations of rural life. The condition of the wall by the late 19th and early 20th centuries varied enormously by section. In the areas close to the major cities, particularly the sections northwest and northeast of Beijing, the wall had retained more of its structure because population density and accessibility meant it had been more visible, more discussed, and in some cases more deliberately maintained as a landmark. In the remote western sections, particularly in the desert and semi-arid areas of Gansu and Inner Mongolia, the Han-era rammed earth walls had been eroding slowly for 2,000 years, and in many places only low, rounded earthen ridges remained to indicate where the wall had once stood. In between, across hundreds of miles of mountain terrain, the picture was mixed, some sections standing nearly at their original height, others reduced to rubble, others missing entirely, where the facing had been taken and the core had subsequently collapsed. The modern world's engagement with the Great Wall as a cultural and historical monument rather than a military installation began in earnest in the 20th century, accelerating significantly after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The new government recognized the wall as a symbol of Chinese civilization and national identity, and beginning in the 1950s, restoration work was undertaken on the most accessible and visually dramatic sections near Beijing. The Badaling section, which sits in a mountain pass northwest of the capital and had retained much of its Ming-era structure, that was the first section to receive major restoration work and was opened to visitors in 1957. The Badaling restoration involved significant reconstruction, not just repair of damaged elements, but the rebuilding of sections that had been substantially reduced or lost entirely. This raised questions that continue to be debated among conservation specialists. How much new material can be added to a historical structure before the restoration itself becomes a distortion of the historical record? The bricks used in the Badaling restoration were made to approximate the dimensions and appearance of the original Ming bricks, but they were produced using modern manufacturing techniques and fired in modern kilns, and they do not have the same material properties as the original 500-year-old bricks they sit alongside. A visitor walking the Badaling section today is walking on a surface that is partly original Ming construction and partly 20th century reconstruction, and it is not always easy to tell which is which. Fun fact: a survey conducted by the Chinese State Administration of Cultural Heritage and released in 2012 found that roughly 30% of the Ming-era Great Wall had disappeared entirely, and that less than 10% was in good condition. The survey covered more than 21,000 kilometers of wall structures from all dynasties, making it the most comprehensive physical assessment of the wall ever conducted. The results were sobering. They revealed that the gradual deterioration of the wall's less visited sections had been proceeding much faster than official estimates had suggested, and that without significant intervention, further large-scale loss was probable. The legacy of the Great Wall in Chinese culture is layered and sometimes contradictory. For much of Chinese history, the wall was associated as much with hardship and suffering as with pride and achievement. The stories of forced labour, the disruption of families, the deaths of workers far from home, these were not forgotten, and they made the wall a complicated symbol. A structure built at such human cost could not simply be celebrated without also being mourned. Chinese literature and art of many periods has held both of these responses simultaneously, acknowledging the wall's grandeur while also acknowledging what it cost. In the 20th century, the wall became increasingly central to a particular vision of Chinese national identity as evidence of the depth and continuity of Chinese civilization, as a symbol of collective human achievement, and as a demonstration of what a unified people could accomplish when working toward a shared purpose. This nationalist framing became dominant in the post-1949 period, and it is the framing most commonly encountered in Chinese official discourse about the wall today. The suffering embedded in the wall's history is not erased in this framing, but it is absorbed into a narrative of collective sacrifice for collective benefit. The idea that the generations who built the wall suffered so that the civilization they were part of could endure. You have been listening to the story of the Great Wall of China, and if you have made it this far, you have traveled through more than 2,000 years of history. Across deserts and mountain ridges and river valleys, through dynasties and wars and centuries of quiet decay and careful reconstruction. That is a long journey for a quiet evening. Let the images of stone and mountain and slow morning light settle into the background of your thoughts. There is nothing that needs your attention now. The wall has stood for 2,000 years, and it will still be standing when morning comes. You do not need to carry any of this with you into sleep, just let it drift. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen, another building, another history, another set of quiet facts to carry you further into the night. And if you enjoyed this one, a like or a subscription means more than you might think, or leave a thought in the comments below. It is always good to know that someone was listening. But for now, let your body relax completely into wherever you are resting. Release the weight of your shoulders. Let your breathing slow to whatever pace it finds on its own. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. The mountains are still. The wall is still. The night is quiet. Good night.